Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were secretly recording members of the British royal family. Now,
King Charles wrote substantial letters to Princess Diana after Andrew Morton's biography was published, in an operational attempt to keep their marriage together, and Hugo Vickers has personally read those letters during the research for his Queen Elizabeth II biography. The Vickers reading of the documentary record establishes that Charles's operational engagement with the late stages of the Diana marriage was substantially different from the public characterization the Sussex household has, subsequently deployed in their commercial framing of family dysfunction. Charles tried, in operational terms, to save the marriage. The letters document the sustained effort. Vickers was invited to read the letters specifically because Paul Burrell, Diana's former butler, had been making public claims about content in Charles's communications that Vickers' institutional access allowed him to verify or refute against the documentary record. The letters Vickers actually read showed Charles operating with the substantive intent to preserve the marriage against the broader narrative framework that has positioned him as the disengaged figure across the documented record.
Recording for Netflix, or potentially gathering material to be used against the British royal family. Now,
Vickers is the historian and broadcaster whose new biography of Queen Elizabeth II draws on more than 60 years of personal observation. Over 40 personal meetings with the late Queen across the period from 1968 to her death, and substantive primary source engagement with Palace documentary archives. The Financial Times has characterized him following the book's release as the most knowledgeable royal biographer on the planet, and his sourcing on the institutional family operates at the highest available level. The framings he places on the public record are therefore documentary contributions to the institutional historical archive rather than commentary assessments. The Charles letters to Fergie that Vickers references operate in the same documentary register, but at a different operational temperature.
Whenever Prince Harry called his grandmother, she asked her lady-in-waiting to stay with her. Hugo Vickers, I guess what this shows, right, is that trust had completely broken down between the Sussexes and the British royal family.
Vickers' framing is that the Fergie letters are sharper than the Diana letters and reflect Charles's underlying assessment that Sarah Ferguson was operationally irresponsible across the period in which she was married to Prince Andrew. The letters are reportedly held in a bank somewhere and have not been released to the broader documentary record. Vickers does not anticipate that they will ever operationally be released. The Charles framing on the Andrew Fergie engagement, which Vickers places on the record, captures the underlying assessment. Charles's documented comment on the engagement was operationally brief. Well, he chose her. The structural meaning of this comment is that Charles, even at the engagement stage, registered the operational concern that Andrew's marriage would not produce the institutional outcomes the family required. The subsequent documentary record has validated the early assessment. The structural significance of these letters for the broader institutional analysis is consequential.
Now, Hugo, again, I think he was being incredibly naive, because as someone who was very close to all of the reporting around that time and revealed the Megxit decision, I know that the late Queen was making the calls. She was making the decisions, wasn't she? It's not as if she was some like senile old woman who didn't know what she was doing.
The Sussex commercial pipeline has operated across 6 years on the framing that the institutional family operates with reduced emotional engagement than the household's commercial framings claim. Charles in particular has been positioned in the Spare memoir, the Oprah interview, the Netflix docuseries, and the broader Sussex commercial output as a figure of reduced fatherly engagement with Harry's operational concerns. The Vickers documentary access to the Diana letters provides the counter-evidence to this framing. Charles, on the documented record, operates with substantial sustained engagement with the family members whose institutional positioning falls within his operational concern. The framing the Sussex pipeline has deployed has therefore been calibrated for commercial impact rather than for substantive accuracy against the institutional documentary record. The Queen's recording protection protocol that Wootton has previously documented and that Vickers has now placed on the documentary record through the personal history is the parallel structural element.
She realised that as Queen, she had to take a certain position. And I guess that that is also what was happening to some extent with the Harry problem, the Harry situation. And then, of course, they invented at the time of the Platinum Jubilee this expression, the working royals, which meant to say that only the ones who were actually working for the royal family would be on the balcony, would be respected in that way. And you've even seen it more recently on her centenary when the King gathered all the working royals together at Buckingham.
The Queen, on Vickers's framing, would not take phone calls from Harry alone in her final years. She asked her lady-in-waiting to remain present during any such phone calls. The structural reasoning is operationally direct. The Queen had reached the institutional position at which she could not trust that the private conversation would remain private. The trust framework on which extended family communication ordinarily operates had been compromised by the cumulative Sussex pipeline of converting private interactions into commercial product. The substitute mechanism was institutional supervision through the lady-in-waiting's presence. The structural meaning is that the Queen operationally adapted her grandmother-grandson relationship to operate through institutional supervision rather than through ordinary family confidence. The adaptation is the documentary marker of how deeply the institutional trust framework had been compromised by the cumulative Sussex commercial deployment.
Most successful members of the royal family are the ones who support the Queen but don't compete with her. And, unfortunately, that Diana, eventually she was competing with the Queen, competing with Prince Charles. That didn't work out so well. Whereas other members of the royal family are very effective in that role.
The Wootton parallel observation on Prince William's recording protection protocol confirms the institutional pattern. William, on Wootton's documented Daily Mail reporting, will not meet Harry without a witness present. The structural reasoning is the same. Any private conversation could subsequently be operationally deployed through Sussex commercial channels, with the framing operationally controlled by the Sussex side. The institutional family cannot extend ordinary family confidence to operational interactions with Harry, because the cumulative documentary record indicates that such confidence will be commercially monetized. The witness protocol therefore operates as the institutional adaptation that allows engagement to continue at a reduced operational register. The Camilla witness role at the September 2024 Clarence House meeting between Harry and Charles is the operational illustration of this protocol in current execution. Camilla was present in the room throughout the meeting. The reason was the same institutional reasoning the Queen had operationalized in her phone call protocol. The Queen's institutional decision-making framework that Vickers develops is the additional structural element worth presenting. The Queen, on his framing, operated with a specific question that distinguished her personal preferences from her institutional duty. Her framing was not, "What should I do?" but "What should the Queen do?" The structural meaning is that the institutional figure operated with the analytical discipline of separating the personal disposition from the institutional position. The personal disposition might prefer one outcome. The institutional position required a different operational decision. The Queen's framing of the question in the third person, "What should the Queen do?" allowed her to access the institutional decision rather than the personal preference. The structural feature of this framework is consequential because it captures the operational discipline that successful constitutional monarchs require.
That if he was going to leak information or potentially take something that was said out of context, there would be a witness there who would be able to back up effectively the royal version of events. Do you think that was the reason why the late Queen was asking, as you revealed in your book, for a lady-in-waiting to stay during her phone calls with Harry?
Yes, I think probably. I mean, I think she, by the way, often did have a lady-in-waiting or a private secretary with her with various...
The personal preferences must be operationally subordinated to the institutional requirements. The figure who cannot perform this subordination is operationally inadequate to the constitutional role. The structural application of this framework to the Megxit decision is consequential. The Queen at the Sandringham Summit in January 2020 operated through the What Should the Queen Do framework. The personal disposition might have produced an accommodation toward Harry's preferences. The institutional position required the structural decision that the half-in, half-out configuration was not operationally possible. The Queen's framework produced the institutional decision rather than the personal accommodation. The structural meaning is that the Sussex household's framing of the Megxit period as the Queen's potential acceptance of their preferred configuration is operationally indefensible against the documented decision-making framework Vickers has now placed on the public record.
Well, I remember when I wrote a book about Prince Philip's mother, I did see Princess Anne on her own, which was great. But Prince Charles had a press secretary sitting next to him during my interview with him. So they do that sometimes. And so that's not totally unusual. But, just probably makes it a bit more difficult for him to come out with outrageous demands and things which, he could then go around saying she said yes, when in fact she had probably said no.
The Queen made the institutional decision through the institutional framework. The decision was not, in operational terms, available for negotiation through personal relationship channels. The Queen's mental capacity through her final years that Vickers places on the documentary record is the structural element that addresses the broader public relations framings that have circulated about her late-stage decisions. Vickers personally met with the Queen in June 2022, approximately 3 months before her death. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. The Queen, on Vickers's professional observation, was bright as a button. She heard everything, she saw everything, she responded to everything. She maintained her characteristic random access to facts that distinguished her institutional operational capacity. The structural meaning is that the Queen's late-stage decisions were operationally made through her full mental capacity rather than under any structural diminishment. The framings the Sussex household has subsequently deployed, which have implicitly positioned the Queen's institutional decisions as the product of palace staff influence on a diminishing figure, are operationally indefensible against the documented record Vickers has provided. The structural illustration Vickers offers of the Queen's documented mental capacity is the Maori bus driver memory anecdote. Vickers, at a reception at Cumberland Lodge in Windsor Great Park, mentioned to the Queen that Prince William was travelling to New Zealand and that a particular Maori chief was refusing to meet him because William had been allocated only 45 minutes for the engagement. Vickers offered the additional historical context that in 1953, when the Queen herself had visited New Zealand, the then Prime Minister, Sidney Holland, had tried to prevent her from meeting the predecessor of the same Maori clan. The Queen's response was operationally immediate. She observed that the current Maori chief was operationally only a bus driver in his everyday life, despite his ceremonial standing.
There's another really interesting revelation in your book, Hugo, which is quite relevant given Netflix are bringing back The Crown, and they're bringing back The Crown to actually look at the earlier years of the life of Queen Elizabeth II, or at the time she was a princess, and her relationship with Prince.
The structural meaning of this response is that the Queen had retained the operational details of figures across decades of institutional engagement and could deploy that detail in real-time conversation without preparation or reminder. The depth of institutional memory is consequential because it captures the underlying operational capacity that the Queen's constitutional role required. The Queen's broader analytical framework on the value of memory for constitutional monarchs is the additional structural element worth presenting. The constitutional monarch, on Vickers's reading, requires substantive operational memory because the institutional advisory function depends on the capacity to draw on historical precedent in real-time conversation with prime ministers and other senior figures. The Queen's framing in such conversations would typically operate through the precedent register
Now, I guess a lot of people would immediately think, oh, well, is it the claims of affairs and that type of thing that they heavily hint at? But no, it was actually in regards to how the producers presented a very traumatic family story.
If a prime minister raised a contemporary institutional difficulty, the Queen could draw on the precedent from her own reign to inform the discussion. Her framework was operationally accumulative. Across 7 decades of weekly conversations with prime ministers, she had developed substantive institutional memory that no other figure in the British political infrastructure could replicate. The prime minister might or might not take her advice, but he would operationally listen to it because the substantive memory she carried was structurally unavailable elsewhere in the political system. The Queen's mimicry capacity is the additional human dimension that Vickers references. The Queen, in private contexts, was reportedly a substantive mimic. She could imitate the transatlantic accent of her uncle, the Duke of Windsor. She had a substantive theatrical sense of timing that informed her institutional engagements. The structural meaning is that the Queen's underlying personal disposition included substantial humorous capacity that her institutional position required her to operationally constrain in public contexts. Her favourite biblical line from Luke was the framing that Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. The structural application Vickers identifies is that the Queen had learned to take in information without operationally needing to make immediate public comment on it. The discipline of operational silence operated as her institutional asset across decades. The public did not, on Vickers's framing, know what she was thinking on most institutional questions. The structural meaning is that the operational discipline produced the institutional respect across political and cultural divisions that her position required. The Queen's softening in her later years that Vickers identifies is the additional operational element worth presenting. After the age of 80, the Queen began to permit herself certain personal indulgences that the earlier institutional discipline had operationally excluded. She allowed herself on an American visit to attend the Kentucky Derby. The framing she reportedly adopted was that if she had not done it by this stage of life, she was never going to do it. She subsequently took a vessel for a Western Isles cruise with her grandchildren, given that the royal yacht Britannia was no longer available. The structural meaning of these late-stage indulgences is that the Queen, having sustained the institutional discipline across nearly 6 decades, had earned the operational space to introduce personal preferences into her remaining years. The duty came first across the institutional career, the personal preferences came second, operationally constrained until the later stages. The structural contrast with the Sussex household's operational pattern is consequential. The Sussex configuration has inverted the framework. Personal preference has operated as the primary register from the early stages of the household's formation. Institutional duty has operated as the secondary register, deployed as the visual cover under which the personal preference configuration is sustained. The working royal terminology that Vickers places on the documentary record is the additional structural element worth presenting.
Direction Équestre Internationale, the Oxford conferences, many things. And I hope one day somebody will be given access to his papers and can really see the full extent of what he achieved, and they'll be fascinated.
He didn't like Fergie. Hugo, has he been proven right on that front?
Well, he went to a lot of trouble with Diana after the Morton book came out.
The term was operationally invented at the time of the Platinum Jubilee in 2022 as the institutional mechanism through which the senior royal family could distinguish operationally active members from operationally inactive ones. The structural application was the balcony composition for the Trooping the Colour and other ceremonial appearances. Only working royals would be on the balcony. Only working royals would be respected in the institutional registers that the Platinum Jubilee was structured to produce. The structural meaning is that the institutional family had reached the operational position at which the wider Mountbatten-Windsor membership could not be operationally accommodated within the visible institutional architecture. The working royal designation was the operational mechanism through which the architecture was disciplined. The centenary engagement at Buckingham Palace this past year, where King Charles assembled the working royals together, operated through the same framework. The Sussex household sits operationally outside the working royal designation.
Anyway, there's a drama about Paul Burrell having said something that he'd said, and they asked me to come and read the letters to see, so that I could see what was in the letters. And they were very, very interesting because he was really trying to do his best to keep that marriage together. I think he rather gave up. Well, he wrote to Fergie as well, but those letters are a little bit sharper, I gather. I think they're kept in the bank somewhere. We haven't seen those, and I don't think we ever will.
The structural meaning is that the household's continuing framing of itself as performing working royal duty operates against the institutional designation that the family has formally adopted. The Vickers structural framework on what makes royal family members successful is consequential. The successful members on his professional reading are the ones who support the Queen but do not compete with her. Diana, despite her substantial public engagement capacity, eventually competed with both the Queen and Prince Charles. The competition was operationally damaging to the institutional architecture because it directed audience attention toward intra-family dynamics rather than toward the substantive institutional work. Other royal family members operate effectively because they support without competing. The structural meaning is that the institutional architecture depends on the wider family operating in support of the reigning monarch, with operational competition being structurally incompatible with the architecture's sustained function.
Because, Hugo, you must accept, and this is why one of the reasons you will go down as such an eminent royal historian, because it was so rare for one man or woman, I guess, with a public profile to get to spend that much time with the Queen over the course of her reign. Very few people who speak publicly were able to do that.
The Sussex household has, on this framework, operated as a competitive rather than supportive element across the past 6 years. The structural consequence is that the architecture has had to respond by separating from the competitive element with the Sandringham invitation withdrawal, the coronation exclusion plan, and the Highgrove photograph removal, operating as the operational expressions of this separation. The structural application of the support not compete framework to Catherine's current institutional positioning is consequential because it captures why her engagement pattern produces the audience response that the documentary record now systematically shows. Catherine, on Vickers' professional reading, operates as the supportive element rather than as the competitive element across her entire institutional career. She did not compete with William during their pre-marriage formation. She did not compete with the late Queen during the period in which she was developing her senior royal positioning. She does not compete with Charles in the current configuration. Her substantive policy work on early learning research operates in support of the institutional architecture rather than in competition with it. The structural meaning is that Catherine has internalized the operational discipline that Diana eventually struggled with and that Meghan has never operationally accessed. The audience response to Catherine, including the Reggio Emilia engagement crowds and the YouGov approval rating at 75%, reflects the operational effectiveness of the supportive disposition that the institutional architecture is calibrated to reward. The structural application to the Sussex household is operationally direct. The household has operated in competitive register across the past 6 years. Each commercial deployment has been calibrated to compete for audience attention against the institutional family's substantive engagements. The Bondi Beach one-off commercialization operated as competition for the Australian tour news cycle. The Archie 7th birthday Instagram drop operated as competition for Catherine's Italy announcement. The Easter Instagram exploitation of the children operated as competition for the broader institutional Easter calendar. The Geneva World Health Organization conference operated as competition for the substantive policy engagement that Catherine and other institutional figures have established across decades. The cumulative effect of the competitive register is that the institutional architecture has reached the operational position at which the Sussex household cannot be accommodated within the supportive framework the architecture requires. The separation that has now consolidated is the operational consequence of the underlying competitive disposition the household has chosen to operate through. The Vickers reading on the family's longer-term operational outlook is the additional analytical element worth presenting. The next generation Cambridge configuration on his framing is operationally robust because William and Catherine have raised their children within the supportive framework rather than within the competitive framework. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis will, on the documented trajectory, enter their adult institutional positioning with the same operational discipline their parents have established. The next reign will therefore operate through a senior royal family that has been operationally calibrated for the institutional duty the architecture requires. The Sussex household's children, Archie and Lilibet, are operating outside this developmental framework. The structural meaning is consequential. The Sussex children are not, in operational terms, being prepared for institutional duty because the household is not operating within the institutional architecture. The children will therefore reach adulthood without the operational training that institutional positioning requires. The structural difference between the two next generation cohorts will be operationally substantial by the time the next reign establishes itself. The Daphne du Maurier Clarence House anecdote that Vickers offers is the closing structural illustration. After King George VI lying in state at Westminster Hall in 1952, the new Queen received Sir Boy Browning, who was operating as her office head and who was married to Daphne du Maurier. Browning subsequently reported to du Maurier on what the Queen had wanted to discuss. The Queen's operational concern at that moment was not personal grief, but the court circular and how it would be published. Du Maurier's structural conclusion on the documented record was that this was going to be a fantastic reign and that the country was in really good hands. The structural meaning is that the Queen operated through institutional duty, even at the moment when personal grief would have justified a substantially different operational response. The institutional discipline that defined her reign was operationally visible from the first moments of the accession. The structural framework continued for the full 70-year duration of the reign. The Sussex household's framing of the institutional family as operating with reduced emotional engagement is operationally indefensible against this documented institutional discipline. The institutional duty Vickers' biography has now placed on the public record is the substantive contribution against which the Sussex commercial framings must now be measured. The closing observation is that the Charles letters to Diana, the Charles letters to Fergie, the Queen's recording protection protocol, the William Witness requirement, the Queen's What Should the Queen Do framework, the documented late-stage mental capacity, the working role terminology, the support not compete framework, and the du Maurier Clarence House observation are facets of the same broader documentary record that Vickers has now made operationally available. The Sussex commercial framings have operated across 6 years on the documentary, and the opacity that the institutional family's actual operational decisions were not accessible to the audience. The Vickers biography has now substantially closed this opacity. The institutional family operates and has operated through substantive, disciplined frameworks that the documentary record validates. The Sussex framings, which positioned the family as operating with reduced engagement, are operationally indefensible against the documented record. The audience reading both elements simultaneously can now perform the structural comparison. The institutional response continues to consolidate through the let them doctrine. The cumulative documentary record continues to expand. The mathematics continue to work through the household's documented financial trajectory. The verdict is in. The Vickers biography has provided the substantive documentary foundation against which the cumulative Sussex framings will now be operationally measured for the foreseeable institutional future.